Well, I'll echo everyone else's comments and say I'm happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderful study. My name is Tom Cortese. I'm a brief outline of my talk. I'm going to first give a little background of myself, since all my colleagues are all distinguished and they all are well known around the world in the field of neuroimaging, but many of you may not know who I am, since I'm not a neuroimager. I'm in fact a computer scientist. So then I'm going to talk a little bit about high-performance computing technology. I actually work with the Blue Water Supercomputer at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. Just to give a little bit of background about what's different between a regular computer and a supercomputer and what possible implications this might have for neuroimaging people who wish to use supercomputers. Then the bulk of my presentation, I'll talk about computing and neuroimaging, things we've learned from our trip abroad, and finally a brief summary. So I work with the Blue Waters computer. As I said, my technical job description is application engineer. What I do is I work with different teams of scientists from many different domains, molecular biology, astrophysics. They know a lot about their science, but they don't necessarily know how the computer is structured. So I help them get the most performance and most effective use of the supercomputer. So the three main problems are porting applications. You have to write a program that runs on Blue Waters. Once you get it running, you have to debug it, make sure it's running correctly. And then once it's running correctly, you want to optimize performance so you don't waste time. I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but I believe someone said once that if you run an application for an hour on Blue Waters and you end up wasting your time, that's like $10,000 of electricity or something. So about the institute itself, NCSA has been founded in 1986. It's one of the original National Science Foundation Supercomputer Center programs. And of course, Blue Waters has got a lot of attention in the media recently. It's the largest academic supercomputer in the world. But NCSA is actually a lot more than that. We have the EXCEED, the Extreme Science and Engineering Discovery Environment, which is nationwide collaboration. And pictures in the lower left is Blue Waters itself, and then the lower right is the outside of the building. Okay, so again, my main emphasis, the reason I want to talk about supercomputer building blocks is in the lower right corner there. I want to emphasize that a supercomputer is not just a bigger, faster PC. It's a fundamentally different type of tool and requires different types of expertise in order to use it effectively. So starting with the processor, most supercomputers now have actually traditional CPUs, Intel, AMD, et cetera, combined with GPUs, graphical processing units, or sometimes GPU they call them. And right away, this brings a challenge. If you're going to write a program that you want running on a supercomputer, do you want to use CPUs or GPUs or some combination? There are advantages to both, and they're not initially obvious. Sometimes a person, like a matrix algorithm, might run faster on a GPU than a CPU, but you don't know it initially. And in terms of neuroimaging, GPUs provide additional challenges because rapid turnaround is very difficult. If you're going to be writing code that's native to, say, CUDA, it's a programming language that is used for GPUs, you might not get your results right away. It might take weeks to develop the code to run correctly, and for rapid prototyping, this is not desirable. So even though GPUs might offer some advantages in neuroimaging, they're offset by the fact that you might need to take more time to develop it might be an impediment. Another issue is scientific libraries. We can all go back and read Cooley and Tukey's original paper and write our own Fourier transform routine, but there's no sense in reinventing the wheel. Most of the supercomputers have scientific libraries for common routines, matrix multiplication, Fourier transforms, et cetera, that are optimized for the particular hardware. So one of the things, if you want to use a supercomputer effectively, is you need to know how to use these libraries. You don't want to be writing your own routines. Storage is very different. You don't just have a single disk anymore. There's often multiple disk controllers, each one taking care of multiple disks. Files are written and read in parallel. You don't want to have, if you have 1,000 or 100,000 cores running on a program, you don't want your single file going to a single disk. You might have different portions of the program reading from different disks and writing. So there's both short-term and long-term storage. What people typically do is use disks for calculations while they're being performed, and then store them for long-term archives onto a tape system. And another issue, not just the mere storage capacity, is the data transfer. If we're talking a lot of times about these big biobanks and large data sets that are centralized, one of the limitations that might prevent neuroimagers from using supercomputers is that it takes too long just to move the data from one place to another. If it's going to take a week to transfer your data across from your center to a supercomputer center, then do some processing on the big machine, and then bring your results back, that might be too much of a bottleneck. So this is another limitation here. I'm not going to go too much into detail about memory, but when we have supercomputers with hundreds of thousands of cores, they don't all access the same memory. It's simply too hard to build them that way with too many wires, too many connections. So what happens is each processor has access to a certain amount of memory, and there's not, if you often, one processor might need values of data that are in another processor's memory, so you have to send it back and forth. And these are other issues that are non-trivial to deal with parallel programming. Everything's held together by a network. SMP stands for symmetric multiprocessing. What typically happens is you have a node on a supercomputer which has maybe 16 or 32 cores, each of which share the memory. But then there may be thousands of nodes. So there's a combination of shared and distributed memory. And lastly, the human interface. Everyone has a PC now. You have your mouse and you can click and point and things. But supercomputers don't. Most of them are using a cryptic Unix command line interface. You have to type all your commands in on a little simple text window. And many people are not accustomed to that. They think, oh, I'm getting access to blue water. This is the greatest computer in the world. There's no mouse, right? So anyway, the reason I went through this description of supercomputing building blocks is to indicate that if you're a neuroimager and you want to use a supercomputer for your research, each one of these things could possibly be an impediment in the way. And what we'll get to later is possible ways to bridge these gaps. Okay, so in neuroimaging, computers are used at a wide variety of scales, from the tiny ones. We talked about Lars Hansen with his tiny wearable smartphones, or smart sensors and smartphones. Using the global positioning technology, you can have people walking around wearing a scanner, and then knowing where they are and what type of social interaction they're having, they can correlate the EEG readings with the interactions that they're experiencing. And then as we go from small to intermediate to large, we have larger, as we go from EEG to MRI to connectivity modeling, we have ever-increasing computational requirements. Okay, so these are some of the areas in which computers are being used in neuroimaging. When we went to all these sites, I tried to ask as many people as I could at our hosts just what they use, how are computer technology useful in their research. So of course there's data acquisition. Larry talked about this in quite a bit of detail earlier. You have to have some method of getting the data, whether it's MRI or EEG. Real-time analysis is also important. Sometimes you can take data and store it on a disk and then look at it again later, do post-processing analysis, but a lot of computing time is necessary for doing real-time analysis. Some people talked about image reconstruction. This was kind of a hit or miss one. Some people said image reconstruction didn't require much computing at all. Other people said it was kind of a bottleneck. So that's just I'm just reporting what they said. Some people actually stack a couple of GPUs next to the reconstructor to help them with the image reconstruction process. And related to that is the hard disk size. When you have a scan, you run your MRI machine, it might take 250 gigabytes of data, and if you're running multiple patients back to back, it's physically hard just to store all that data, and maybe have to swap disk drives or do something to speed that up. And as was mentioned, many research questions center on both temporal and spatial dynamics, so you need both temporal and spatial resolution to be as high as possible. So for neural network modeling, people that are trying to model the entire brain connectivity using graph theory. Also, early diagnosis was mentioned. There's a potential for a computer might look at an image, MRI image, and might detect some plaque and raise a flag to a radiologist. Hey, this patient may be showing early signs of Alzheimer's disease. So it's certainly not possible right now for a computer to replace a trained radiologist, but certainly computer technology has the potential to at least alert radiologists to potential issues. Pre-surgical mapping, this was also mentioned by somebody else. Databases are ever increasing. This is one of probably the biggest issues is all these increasing temporal resolution, increasing spatial resolution is generating more and more data. What do we do with it? Well, we don't want to just throw it away, right? But the idea of storing it somewhere, letting other people use it, trying to reread it in the future to perhaps a new study comes out, you want to compare your results with something new. So databases are becoming yet another big way in which computers are being used. And a couple interesting ones near the bottom one, the document mining. I wouldn't have thought of this, but one of the researchers that we talked to in Finland talks about they're actually using the computers to go through all sorts of online images of MRI and other data, even graphs, to try to do meta studies. I wouldn't have thought of that, but they're working on that. And Tor already mentioned machine learning. And visualization is also important. There's a lot of, at the KAIST Institute, the Korean place we visited, there's something called the PAX, the Picture Archiving System. So, okay, so one of the things we're tasked with in the study was to try to not only find out what the current state of the art of neuroimaging is, but also to look at what some of the limitations are. In other words, if future funding were invested in certain areas, where would you get the most bang for your buck? So I made a list of several responses I got from various of our hosts. First of all, the image reconstruction with the advanced iterative algorithms. Some people said that this was a very computationally intensive task, which required lots of computer resources. Some people had clusters in their labs. Some people just used like workstations. And then, see, I already mentioned real-time analysis and advanced causal models. So I guess I don't have to read the slide. You all can read, but I'll go to the bottom two. The software approval and liability issue is something that was mentioned at the Aalto University in Finland. Some people have homegrown software that they want to use with their scanners, but then they have trouble getting it approved, and they're worried about liability, like what if their software could damage the machine or produce a result that's not correct. So, and developing new models is a very big limitation, since it's very difficult to, especially if you're using a supercomputer where you don't usually get very rapid turnaround times of your jobs, it's very difficult to try a new idea, write a program, test it out. You know, if it takes a couple days for your job to come back, it's not really conducive to, hey, let's try this, and then rapidly, quickly do something and then see if it works. So these are some of the limitations that were mentioned. Hang on a sec. Also, in Stockholm, the researchers mentioned that the main problem for bottleneck is not the time spent in the scanner. That can be certainly an issue. A lot of these scanners are booked months in advance, but that the analysis time is actually more of a bottleneck than the actual scanner availability. I've already mentioned the differences between scanners, and there's a wide range of length scales involved, and this is another reason that supercomputing is often required for real detailed analysis. If you want to model the brain, starting at molecular interactions, going up to cellular interactions, going from, Larry Wald gave a much better description of the various length scales involved. It's very difficult to have a program that can resolve the finest length scales and the largest ones as well. So this is my area. I'm an HPC guy, high performance computing. So this is probably one of the most surprising things that I learned on this trip, is that only a very relatively small number of the people we've talked to actually use supercomputers. And I expected more people would be doing that. And I asked them why. And, well, of course, cost. Not everyone can afford one, but supercomputers are mainly centralized facilities anyway. Time, that's also not just time to do the computations, but time to transfer your data to and from the center. That could be a significant bottleneck. Limited access, you have to apply for allocations, which means you have to write a grant, write a proposal, and you may or may not get it. Supercomputers are non-interactive. As I think I mentioned before, most computing jobs are done in what's called batch mode. You submit a job, you have to wait maybe an hour or two or a day to start, maybe an hour or two or a day for it to finish, which is very difficult to do rapid prototyping in that type of environment. There's a steep learning curve, which is why I brought the whole supercomputer block slide together, is that it's not just a big PC. If you want to use a supercomputer to do your work, you have a lot of potential obstacles in front of you. And what I call tunnel vision is, due to the nature of research and the way things work, we tend to go on and become more and more specialized in narrow areas. And there may be a lot of neuroimagers out there that simply aren't aware of what supercomputers might be able to do for them. Okay, well, these are a couple other approaches. Instead of using just standardized computers, supercomputers or PCs, workstations, clusters, whatever, Dr. Anders Lassner at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology, he's actually designing integrating circuits that simulate neurons. So he's actually making special hardware. It's like basically designing his own little processor. So that's another approach that I thought was interesting. And at the Carolina Institute in Sweden, they're combining PET scanners and other computational technology. Tor touched upon this a little earlier. So it's not just traditional computers. There are some innovative approaches to working with computers and imaging. So this is another large topic. Everyone's talking about big data. At the supercomputing meeting last year in Denver, it's every year, it's November. Last year happened to be in Denver. It seems like number crunching is not the biggest deal anymore. People are always talking about we need faster processors, we need more processors, we got to crunch more data. But now, big data, what do we do with all this stuff? Do we store it on tape? How do we transfer it back and forth? This is a large deal. There's a report by McKinsey, Big Data, the Next Frontier for Innovation, Competition and Productivity. There's a National Science Foundation's Big Data Initiative. So the reason that that we're having more and more issues with data is the higher spatial and temporal resolution, especially due to the multimodal acquisition, as was already discussed. As the magnet strength increases, we're getting higher and higher resolution, which generates more and more data. We're getting, of course, the more people are scanned, more patients will be acquiring more data. And what to do with all this is non-trivial. Let's say we store some patient data, and then you want to look at it a few years later to compare with maybe a new paper that's come out. What if you might not have the same version of MATLAB? Or you might not have, it might even be difficult to read it. There's different formats, different scanners. Also important are issues of collaboration, privacy, and security. Are we going to store all this data in a centralized location, or is each person going to have their own little local storage? And if you want to collaborate with other researchers, what type of metadata is associated with these data? You're just going to store a bunch of files, patient 01, or you have to have some way of identifying which patient is associated with which data, but you also have to maintain privacy. You don't want to be people to find out, oh, I looked at Fred's MRI scan and I can see he's got whatever. So, and again, the data transfer bottleneck is becoming more and more important. As these files become larger and larger, you can't just transfer them from one computer to another very easily. So what I think would be interesting, my personal take on this, and again, I'm not a neuroimager, so I'm very different from all the other presentations you've seen today, is I think that by closing the high-performance computing and neuroimaging gap could actually be a huge opportunity. It would require training. You have to have people that are experts in supercomputing that could perhaps give seminars that neuroimagers can attend that show the advantages of supercomputing, perhaps how their work could benefit. Getting allocations. Someone could help write grant proposals. I know people that are writing grant applications to get blue water supercomputing time. One of the things they have to mention is, why do you need blue waters? Why can't you use a smaller computer? They have to say some reason why their research requires such a gigantic computer. Interactive access, if that could be improved, would be much easier. A lot of people are put off by the batch mode model of supercomputers. They would like to be able to sit down and type something, try a new parameter, and then just run it. And it's very difficult to do on a supercomputer. So if that could be improved, that would help close the gap. And last one is expert. I don't want to call myself an expert, but I'm hired as a person, I say liaison, I like that word better. I act between the domain scientist who knows their science very well, and I know the computer reasonably well. So more people like that could interface with neuroimagers that don't necessarily know everything about neuroimaging, just like the neuroimager doesn't know everything about computing. That could help close the gap here. Now, paradoxically, there were a small number of researchers that did use supercomputers in their research. At the Bekan Center in Berlin, Dr. Petra Ritter is doing brain connectivity, and there were a few others. And they brought up an interesting point that since we're getting more and more data, and the computer technology might not be developing as quickly, that there's another potential for another gap between what's the amount of data that's going to be generated and the amount of processing power or data storage or data transferring capabilities. So I'll end with questions, but here's my parting shot. If we have a better pairing of supercomputers with neuroimaging, can this help advance the field? Let's find out. Thank you.
I wonder how, most people in the field would use, clusters, some sort of compute cluster. They would use, some sort of multi-node cluster, 256 nodes, sprinkled with GPUs. That's sort of the norm in the business. How far is that different from being a supercomputer? Is that sort of a baby supercomputer? Is in some sense, you'd want to get to the end of the utility of that sort of $200,000 solution before you made the jump to the really expensive stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Because our reconstructions are run day and night. It's not just one experiment and you're done. 6 months later, you do another experiment. It's 24/7. We would, conceivably, if we use the full power of your supercomputer, we would use it all day, every day, 365 days a year, which would presumably be expensive.
Yes, you'd have to compete with other users for the same resource.
We couldn't compete with other users. We'd have to use it, right? So if we became dependent on it, we would need to buy it, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, there's another possibility. I mean, a supercomputer with hundreds of thousands of nodes, yes, it is very much, in a way, like a large cluster. So if you're familiar with using a Linux cluster, if you have someone that maintains it, installs software on it, upgrades, etc., then, yeah, the jump to a supercomputer wouldn't be that big. And if you're doing 24 hours on your cluster, that might take 6 minutes on a supercomputer if you use it. So if you run let's say one hour job every day on a supercomputer, that might be the same processing power as your entire cluster. So you might be able to, a supercomputer might be, say, 100 times your cluster, which means you could do technically 1/100th of the time instead of having it run all the time.
Then my question boils down to, would it be cost effective? I mean, compared to this sort of $200,000 cluster run 24/7, could I get the same amount of computing done cheaper on your facility?
Well, it depends on how you define cost. For accessing Blue Waters, there's no money involved. You have to write a proposal, and if you get accepted, you get a certain number of node hours. So there wouldn't be any physical money that would cost you at all. Now, again, there would be the problem of transferring data to it, running the job, and bringing the data back. And
must be some cost.
Oh yeah, of course, someone's paying for it, but National Science Foundation, they're funding the machine, but no, if you're a principal investigator and you get an allocation on Blue Waters, they don't come around and say, hey, we need some money. You just go ahead and burn up your allocation.
So in terms of efficiencies, though, I mean, it's sort of along the lines, let's say it is free, but still it seems the cost or the time of transferring all that data and then doing it seems that seems like a bigger bottleneck than the computing speed. I mean, you could have a local supercluster or we have like a Beowulf cluster and maybe the local network's faster, and so that might overall still be a more efficient solution for most sites than transferring all this data far away, having it work, number crunch for a long time. And troubleshooting, right?
Yeah, those are definitely big issues. I wish I had the answer. It's like I said, it's one of the big computational challenges is what to do with this data. Should we store it all in one place? But then, let's say I want to access someone's research data. Do I use it while it's there, or do I somehow bring it over to my site, work with it, and send it back? I wish I had the answer. It's a serious problem, and it's only going to get worse. Globus Online is what people use for file transfers mostly, and
it seems like the solution will be. Seems like it will just be that each site will get on their local network better and better computing facilities, and to sort of match at least for neuroimaging data. But
because we're running into a similar issue with the non-neuroimaging. There are several dozen science teams that are using Blue Waters right now, and they're generating terabytes worth of data. Some may be up in the petabytes range over a couple of years. And what are they going to do with that? We can't leave it on our machine forever, and eventually their allocation's going to go. So are they going to try to transfer that to some system at their own university, or who's going to want to transfer 300 terabytes to their own? Take a week. Yes.
So I have a question about the Blue Brain project, which we didn't visit just because there had been other studies that had gone there. But I would be very curious as to your opinion on that, because it seems as if that's one of the very interesting examples where even if they were completely unsuccessful in creating a simulated brain, they would still have transformed computational science to such a degree that it would be an advance in a totally different area. And
Yeah,
I was wondering if you're keeping up with that.
Not as much as I should. There are many. I have a few other things that are going on in my brain, but I can comment a little bit on that. One of the things that Dr. Wald mentioned earlier is the 10 to the 12th orders of magnitude difference between the current brain connectivity models and the actual brain with the millions of neurons, billions of synapses. So I'm interested in these things, but since I'm not actually a neuroimager per se, these things don't come up very often in my day-to-day life. So wish I had a better answer for that, but I might have to pass that along to the neuroimaging community. Dr. Conway?
Yeah, a bit of a paradigm shift. The National Science Foundation is funding this Blue Waters project, which is a broad spectrum application of all of the various science and engineering applications that NSF funds. What about if we had something similar that NIH funded that was specifically focused on imaging, that was available for the entire country? So then, as far as software development, dealing with troubleshooting, it would be specifically for imaging, and it would be could be a storage house for data as well. I mean, it could be a focal point. So it would be a subset of this broad spectrum application that you have at Blue Waters.
And if I could follow up on that briefly, there's a discussion at NCSA now, with actually a countrywide, I don't believe it's just site-specific, national data storage repository, which is one of the possible solutions for alleviating the problem of all these researchers having all these terabytes of data. There might be a place where they might be able to keep it centrally, and that'll be maintained for a longer time. Yeah, something like a cloud model, but more for data storage. But yeah, that's a great idea. Have another initiative for another machine that might be maybe more GPU, since that might be helpful. Sort of. Oh, well, show me where the dotted line is.
Thank you very much. And we'll now move to our coffee break.